Recorded at an undisclosed location known only as the Homestead. You've tuned into Ever Vigilant. Our mission? To encourage and challenge men to prepare, defend, and lead at home and in their communities.
In the evolution of fear, a decisive moment occurred in the 19th century when people in advertising and journalism discovered that if they framed their stories and appeals with fear, they could capture our attention. It is an emotion we find hard to resist or control, and they constantly shifted our focus to a new possible source of anxiety. The latest health scare, the new crime wave, a social faux pas we might be committing, the endless hazards in our environment which we were not aware, with an increasing sophistication of media and visceral quality of imagery, they have been able to give us the feeling that we are fragile creatures in an environment full of danger, even though we live in a world infinitely safer and more predictable than anything our ancestors knew. With their help, our anxieties have only increased. That is an excerpt from a book I'm reading right now called The 50th Law by Curtis Jackson, aka 50 Cent, and Robert Greene. My name is Joe Prim. You've tuned into an episode of Ever Vigilant. I've been doing this podcast for quite some time now. If this is the first time joining, thank you. I appreciate it. If you've been listening for a long time, thanks for sticking around. I hope you get something out of this episode. I will be quoting quite heavily from a couple of books today. One of them will be the book I just mentioned, The 50th Law. The second one is Fear is Fuel by Patrick J. Sweeney II. I highly recommend that book. The 50th Law, I'm just a little bit better than halfway through, so I'll hold my recommendation on that one as of yet. But so far it is a good read. That segment from the 50th Law reminded me a lot when I read it of Proverbs 28:1. The wicked flee when no one pursues, but the righteous are bold as lions. Anybody who's been listening to this podcast for a short amount of time, and then there's people that listen to this podcast that have had conversations with me, whether in email or interviews for this podcast, and then there's a select number of guys even out there who have worked with me on a day in and day out basis and know who I am, how I react to the good, how I react to the bad, and whether it be move way out to the homestead, which we did from the suburbs, or whether it be move down to Texas without a job or a home, or whether it be, as I recently did in the middle of a pandemic, quit my job with one company to start with another company to take on more responsibility in order to, at the same time, I guess, crazily push myself outside of my comfort zone once again. The one area where probably most people would think that I have a pretty good handle on would be fear. But the reality is, fear is something you're always trying to get a hold of. Fear is something we're always fighting, or it's pushing us into the corner. Either you're winning that battle, or you've lost that battle. Either you're fighting that battle, or you've lost that battle, I should say. So when I started reading Fear is Fuel, again, and I'll mention the author because I highly recommend this book to anybody out there, by Patrick J. Sweeney II, it sucked me in because it started showing me fear and the reality of fear in a different light, from a very scientific viewpoint in some sections. In other sections, does a great job of helping you understand how to fight your fears, the reality of what courage really is. So I spent a lot of time studying that book, taking extensive notes, narrowing those notes down to stuff that I could pull out to form a decent podcast. So I spent a lot of time, put a lot of energy, put a lot of effort into building this podcast so that it would be a good primer, a great place to start grasping and getting a better understanding of what fear is, how to fight against it, so you can start down a path to educate yourself on fighting against fear and why cowardice is so vile and looked down upon so much from a biblical point of view. If we can learn one thing and one thing only from this pandemic, from this crisis of this coronavirus, it needs to be the power of fear. People everywhere have been grabbed onto and held down by a virus called fear. And the only cure for that virus is courage and understanding. One of the biggest problems with fear, as Robert Greene mentions in his book, is fear creates its own self-fulfilling dynamic. As people give into it, they lose energy and momentum. Their lack of confidence translates into inaction, and that lowers the confidence levels even further, and on and on. The first thing that we really need to understand about fear is that almost all of fear sprouts out of things that we have never experienced and never imagined. So get your mind around that concept. Almost all of the things in your life that you have fear of is because you have never experienced them or have never fully imagined and walked yourself through that situation. A perfect example of this is I was talking to my daughter the other day, and she was telling me how the second time that she was telling me and her younger brother, who is very afraid of wasps, that the second time that she got stung by a wasp was really not a big deal. It was far less painful and far less scary than the first time. Is it true that it was any less painful? No. But the reality of it and the fact that she had experienced it once already and survived, and it was only painful for a certain amount of time, led her to the belief that the second time it wasn't as bad. And her fear of wasps is now gone. Same thing with the pandemic for my family. As I spoke early on about the pandemic and talking about getting ready, this pandemic was nothing like I would have imagined. So the level of fear in my family and for myself so far has been very, very minor. Because we were as prepared as we could possibly be for a situation where we don't know what's going to happen next. So we do our best to prepare. These are situations that I have walked through in my mind many, many times before we get there. Again, we can go back to another situation, like getting laid off from your job. The first time I was ever laid off, it was a rough, very, very difficult experience. After that, getting laid off subsequent times, never missed a meal. I've never missed a mortgage payment. God has always been faithful to bring me through those times that could have been difficult. And my only regrets through those times of being laid off are that I didn't leverage that time better. That I didn't use that time where I was free of my regular work responsibilities, that I didn't leverage that time to greater advantage for myself, for my family, for my faith. So as you experience things, the fear diminishes. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they were saying about how fearful they were of losing their job. But then once they mentally walked through what would happen step by step if they did lose their job, all of a sudden they realized that that fear was not warranted. Of course, you don't want to lose your job. There's some security in having a job, knowing where you fit in, where you're at. But the other side of that is there may be opportunities to do something different on the other side of what you already know. But until you experience that, or until you've mentally imagined or walked through those steps, fear will try to strangle you. The other thing we need to understand about fear is that fear can be good when it's warranted, and fear can be bad just as much. In the majority of the time in this world that we're living in today, of relative safety and security, fear is a bad thing. It's holding us back from moving forward or taking advantage of situations because we're afraid. To look at this from a different angle, it's good to have fear if we see a bear while we're in the woods, right? Very simple. It's not good if we see a stump that looks like a bear in the woods and we react as if it's a bear, right? The other side of that, the really funny part, is that rarely will we see a bear in the woods that looks like a stump, but we'll often see stumps in the woods that look like a bear, right? Because we're fearful. So we even start to see things that aren't even there. In Fear is Fuel, it says, experience and imagination change your roster of possible outcomes. The more memories you have to reference, the more you can create different hypotheses or guesses about the future. We need to get comfortable with fear. We know it's only our survival mechanism and learn how to use fear optimally when we make life decisions. We must look at life as a challenge and not a threat if we want to live a good life and be happy, fulfilled, and in loving relationships. And that's why in 2 Timothy 1:7, it's made so clear that God has not given a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. Or, in some versions, they say self-discipline. So self-discipline and a sound mind, thinking things through clearly, just as we talked about, right? Either through experience or through imagination, through mentally walking through the scenarios, right? Of that being a sound mind, seeing the stump rather than the bear, that's the opposite of fear. Teddy Roosevelt advises that once you suspend judgment about winning or losing, or pointing out where others have failed, you can live an entirely different life. He shared these ideals in the 1910 speech he delivered at Paris's Sorbonne University that has inspired millions. It's commonly called the man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again. But there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who never knew victory nor defeat. Psalm 118:6 puts it this way, the Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? Two perfect examples of what the consequences are of being fearful, of sitting back and commenting on what others are doing and where others are going, or what others have said, or what you think somebody else meant, versus getting into the arena and living life. Life with its hardships, life with its wins, life with its fails. So what can we do if we want to get back into the arena? right? When you were a young boy, you were in the arena, right? Climbing trees, running races, playing dodgeball. You were in the midst of winning, losing, experiencing life, skinning your knees, your elbows, breaking your leg, whatever it was, right? We were in the mix. Now we move forward in life. We have more responsibilities. We got more things to think about, to worry about, to plan for. And the reality is most of these things just become excuses to be spectators, to be in the stands, poking fun at politicians, making comments on the quarterback and the 3 interceptions he threw last Sunday. Because rather than paying attention to your own life and what you are doing and the example that you are putting forward for your children and for your wife and for your community and for your church, you're worried about what everybody else is doing because that's easy. So what do? Really, step number 1 is we need to evaluate yourself. I've been talking about this through the entirety of Ever Vigilant, is the necessity to constantly be evaluating yourself, who you are, where your strengths are, where your weaknesses are, what the positives are in your life, what the negatives are in your life, so you can focus on fixing those weaknesses, so you can work on fixing those negatives in your life. We don't need to focus on the positives. Those things are taking care of themselves. We need to find those weaknesses, those difficult parts in our life, and we need to look at them in the face and get to battle with them. So what are your fears? Are you afraid of losing your job? Are you afraid of losing your wife? Are you afraid of not having food on the table during this time of craziness and pandemic? Are you afraid that your children are going to somehow see who you really are and not who you're trying to pretend to be? Are you afraid at work that somehow they're going to see the areas where you've been cheating and kind of manipulating things to make it look like you're doing more than you actually are because you're only doing the minimum? What are your fears? Maybe getting on a plane. We all have fears. We all have things that go back to the time when we were kids, and we carry them with us. First step is we got to evaluate those things. What are the main fears that are holding you back from being that man in the arena, from living your life? Then we need to understand what our fear tells are. And see, like I've said before, I am not somebody who appears to be a man with fears, right? I've made some bold moves and said some bold things to some bold people in my life. And the people that have known me face to face, have spent time with me, know I've shut down construction projects because I felt things were unsafe. Was there a possibility of losing my job? You're right, there was. Did I think I would lose my job? Sure did. But the reality was I was far more concerned about the safety of everybody involved than I was about keeping my job. But the reality is, even though there are times where I've made those bold moves, and to some I may seem fearless, there's still always other things in your life that bring you fear. One, for me, as odd as it might seem, I'll be totally open and honest with you guys, is I am really at the core of myself as much of an introvert as you could be. So getting out, getting about, and one thing in particular for me has been making phone calls. I don't know where exactly that fear came from. I don't know why it has been something that has been difficult for me. But one of my biggest things that was holding me back was my ability to just pick up the phone, boom, and call somebody. So through reading this book, Fear as Fuel, by Patrick J. Sweeney, that was one of the first things when I started looking at and evaluating and trying to understand my fear tells was, bam, man, whenever I got to pick up the phone and call a superintendent or call this person or call that person, man, the heart starts beating. I feel nervous. I don't feel my regular confident self. So then what do? When you start to realize what those tells are, it gives you a better insight then into where your weaknesses are, right? We don't need to focus so much on those strengths. We got those areas taken care of. But if I see a fear tell, starting to get a little sweaty in the palms, heart starts beating a little faster, start to get those butterflies in your stomach when somebody brings up a certain topic, and maybe you're thinking about it right now, and just thinking about it as I'm talking about it here has you showing some of your fear tells. Maybe it's having that conversations with your wife or bringing up topics with your kids because you know it's going to explode, or you could explode into a big fight. So after you start to realize what those tells are, helps educate you even more specifically after your evaluation of what those fears are. And then the next time you feel that way, you know what you need to do. But the step in between realizing those tells through evaluation is to start to educate yourself. One thing for me that I have done that has helped tremendously with making phone calls, with having conversations, and for the most part, it's always been those conversations on the phone versus in person. In person, it doesn't bother me so much, but on the phone. So in my mind, scripting through what I want to say in that conversation, the points that I need to get across, sometimes I even will jot down a few notes so that I make sure that conversation goes as smoothly as possible. I need to ask this guy these 3 questions. I need to remind him about this. I have it written down. I make the phone call, zip through those, get my answers, and it's done. But again, that's where educating yourself. You have a fear of planes? You have a fear of how you are as a parent? Start reading some books. Start read a book about fear. Read a book about parenting. Read a book about finances. Know somebody in your life that you think would be a great person, a mentor to help you through some of the fears that you have, maybe of business, the fears that you have of losing your job. Go ask them some questions. And then get yourself prepared to take that next step. Because what's the next step? To face down that fear. To hit it head on. And then is your fear going to magically disappear? No. We'll do it again. We'll re-educate ourselves. We'll re-evaluate ourselves. We'll look at those fear tells again, and then we'll prepare and we'll go after it again. In Fear is Fuel, they recommend it like this. Tackle one fear at a time. Learn to face that fear. Get used to your body's changes, your tells, and expose yourself more and more to that specific fear. He has a little system that's called BASE. Breathe, assess, smile, and eliminate shortcuts. Eliminate those ways of you can back out of the situation and the fear that you need to face. It's easy to remember. Neuroscience-based method of putting fear to work for you. Again, breathe, assess, smile, and eliminate those shortcuts. And the reason he says smiles is because even forcing a fake smile when you are in a high stress state, when there is anxiety or uncertainty or free energy, can reduce cortisol, the stress hormone, by up to 80%. So let me repeat that again because I think that it is an outstanding tool that we need to put in our repertoire and use often. Smiling. Even forcing a fake smile when you are in a high stress state, when there is anxiety or uncertainty or free energy, can reduce cortisol by up to 80%. Why do we need to face our fears, and why do we need to have a better understanding of our fears and who we are? Because we do not want to be cowards. We do not want to be cowardly. And why is that? I mentioned earlier that the Bible makes it very clear that cowardice is not acceptable. I was referring to Revelation 21:8, and it puts the cowardly in a group with a lot of people that you wouldn't think the cowardly would belong to in our society and culturally the way that we look at them. But I'm going to get a little deeper into why John in Revelation talks about cowardice this way. Revelation says, "But the cowardly, the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic, the idolaters, and all liars, they will be consigned to the fiery lake of burning sulfur." This is the second death. So let's look at this list again, because when we talk about cowardice, we kind of just think about the cowardly lion, and it's kind of funny and kind of silly, and we're missing the point. John puts the cowardly in this group with the unbelieving, the vile, the murderers, the sexually immoral, those who practice magic, the idolaters, and all liars. Not a group I want to be a part of. So to get a better understanding of what cowardice is and why John, who wrote Revelation, looked down on it and put it in with a lump of other awful, awful types of people, we can go back to the father of Stoicism, Epictetus, and he says the source of all human evils and of mean-spiritedness and cowardice is not death, but the fear of death. I'm going to repeat that again because this is something to remember. Because we as Christians were told that the spirit of fear was not from God, and that we know and have a clear understanding of where we're going after we pass. And if we have a clear understanding and a confidence and a belief in where we're going after we die, then we should have absolutely no fear of death. Again, Epictetus said, the source of all human evils and of mean-spiritedness and cowardice is not death, but rather the fear of death. In Fear is Fuel, they said this: courage comes after you make the choice. You don't have to be a coward. Cowardice is simply a higher value placed on self-preservation than a loftier external motivation such as virtue or sympathy, or, and I would add, your faith. Again, let's get back to this one more time here. Courage comes after the choice. So if you make a choice to do right, to do good, no matter what the consequences are, you make that choice, you begin to follow through, and then there's courage. So if you're cowardice, or you're cowardly, you already made a choice, but you made a choice going in the opposite direction. Back to Fear is Fuel, we all have unlimited potential, but cannot simultaneously reach that potential and be a coward. You must choose to be brave. You must take risks. Again, another reason why the cowards are mentioned in Revelation 21:8. Because rather than see and use and live in their potential for themselves, for their children, for their wife, for their community, for their church, they are choosing to stay in their comfort zone, to stay in their safe place, in choosing cowardice. Because he says we all have unlimited potential, but we cannot simultaneously reach that potential that we have been designed, created, and built for, and be a coward. You must choose to be brave and take risks. Courage comes after you make the choice. You don't have to be a coward. Again, cowardice simply putting a higher value on self-preservation than on an external motivation such as virtue or sympathy. Courage is the ability to recognize fear, compartmentalize it, where you can either be unhampered by it, or better yet, you are able to use it for the ultimate fuel. Courage, in fact, requires fear. Simple, right? If there's no fear involved, you're just going about your daily activities. You're just doing what you do or what you know how to do. Only if there's fear involved do you need courage. 1 Corinthians 16:13 puts it this way: be on your guard. Stand firm in your faith. Be courageous and be strong. Dance with the angel of death. Live the knowledge that your origin is your destination. This world is temporary. Live in the present, grateful for everything that you have, with the realization that it could all be taken away in the blink of an eye. No comfort zone, no safe space is going to prevent difficulties, tragedy, and tsunamis from hitting you in your life. All that you can do is mentally prepare yourself, know that you are going to make the right decisions, and be ready as much as possible for when these situations come your way. Napoleon Bonaparte represents a classic fearless type. He began his career in the military just as the French Revolution exploded. At this critical moment in his life, he had to experience one of the most chaotic and terrifying periods of history. He faced the endless dangers on the battlefield as a new kind of warfare was emerging. He navigated through the innumerable political intrigues in which one wrong move could have led to the guillotine. He emerged from all of this with a fearless spirit, embracing the chaos of the time and the vast changes going on in the art of war. And in one of his innumerable campaigns, he expressed the words that could serve as the motto for all fearless types. In the spring of 1800, he was preparing to lead an army into Italy. His field marshals warned him that the Alps were not passable at that time of the year and told him to wait, even though waiting would spoil their chances for success. The general replied to them, "For Napoleon's army, there shall be no Alps." And mounted on a mule, Napoleon proceeded to personally lead his troops through the treacherous terrain and past innumerable obstacles. It was the force of one man's will that brought them through the Alps, catching the enemy completely by surprise and defeating them. There are no Alps and no obstacles that can stand in the way of a person without fears. That's another excellent excerpt from the 50th Law. Fear is Fuel says this: the victim mindset is one that believes life happens to you, not by you. Fear is Fuel is built on the premise that there are two ways to make a decision in life. One is based on fear, the other based on opportunity, or sound mind, self-discipline. People who make decisions based on fear often do so because they have an overpowering victim mindset. It is often the default mindset that comes naturally to so many of us because all the data that was put into our mental hard drives growing up. Every time you use fear as fuel, you build a stronger cranial immune system. Self-discipline, again, sound mind. When you seek out challenges, your brain's protection system has to keep revved up to meet the potential threat. Flexing your brain isn't a whole lot different than using your muscles. Lounging on the couch, conserving energy for the ultimate Armageddon battle will benefit you with a few days of recovery. If months or years go by and you're not training your defenses, then when you would wield a sword in battle, you'll feel like Mr. Simpsons, or the Simpsons' Mr. Burns, unable to lift the sword off the rack after years of eating bonbons and watching cartoons. The flip side is that if you started working out today, just 1 or 2 push-ups a day and adding a couple more repetitions each week, before you know it, you would be able to bang out 25 push-ups without thinking about it. Grabbing the sword like Galahad would be easy as you swagger to the fight. You become stronger and your body works better because incrementally increasing stress. Your mind is the same. You purportedly get outside your expectations, creating a free energy moment that pushes your body out of balance, and therefore it must compensate and get back to the expected state or change the expectations. If we can avoid relying on shortcuts our mind uses, we will end up happier, making better decisions, being more creative, understanding more of the world, and staving off memory and cognitive disorders such as Alzheimer's and dementia. That bucket of benefits comes to us by eliminating balance. Continue your journey, be brave, be courageous, and welcome fear every day. Never shy away from it, even when it's difficult. Push your fear's frontier little by little. Continue to take risks even after you've exceeded your goals. You will find more fear and learn from it. Don't do it just for yourself. Be brave for everyone who loves you and who depends on you. Use fear as fuel and inspire all the people who don't even know who someday may hear your story and change their lives too. That ending part was once again from Fear is Fuel by Patrick J. Sweeney II. Again, highly recommend that book. I hope that you have gotten a better understanding of fear, how to fight fear, and what will happen in your life if you fight those fears. Fighting against those fears, building your faith muscles, these are things that make a difference in your life. When you give God the opportunity to shine, instead of trying to take care of everything on your own, when you get outside of your comfort zone, when you get outside of where you know everybody's name, where you feel comfortable, you give yourself the opportunity to grow in a crazy amount of different ways. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ever Vigilant. You can go to vigilantwolf.com, check out the articles there. Got the full archives of the podcast there on the website. Big shout out to the Wolf Pack as always for supporting this mission and keeping it moving forward. Thank you for your reviews. Thank you for sharing this podcast. Thank you for your encouragement. I pray and hope that this episode will make a difference in your life. If this is something that interests you, if you want to get a better grasp on fear and how to fight the fears in your life, like I've said 3 or 4 or 6 or 10 or 100 times already in this episode, I highly recommend Fear is Fuel by Patrick J. Sweeney. Hold fast. God bless.
For the strength of the pack is the wolf, and the strength of the wolf is the pack.